The November wind cut through Marcus Caldwell's jacket like a blade as he guided his horse through the overgrown section of Willowbrook Cemetery. What had started as a search for his missing cattle had led him deep into the abandoned part of the graveyard, where weathered headstones leaned at odd angles and twisted oak trees cast long shadows in the fading daylight. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus had been ranching this land outside Millfield, Texas, for nearly 30 years, inheriting the sprawling property from his father. He knew every acre, every fence line, every watering hole. But cattle had been disappearing for weeks now, and the trail had led him here, to this forgotten corner where the living rarely ventured. His horse, Dakota, snorted nervously as they moved between the crumbling monuments. The animal's ears twitched at every sound, the rustle of dead leaves, the creak of old metal fence posts, the distant call of a crow. Marcus patted the horse's neck, trying to calm both Dakota and his own growing unease. The sun was setting fast, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful anywhere else. Here, surrounded by decades of neglect and the weight of forgotten lives, the approaching darkness felt ominous. Marcus pulled his flashlight from his saddlebag, clicking it on as shadows began to pool around the base of the larger monuments. He was about to turn back when Dakota suddenly reared, nearly throwing him from the saddle. The horse whinnied in terror, backing away from something Marcus couldn't yet see. Fighting to maintain control, Marcus aimed his flashlight in the direction that had spooked his horse. The beam of light swept across weathered granite and marble until it landed on something that made his blood run cold. There, tied to an elaborate Victorian grave marker, was a young woman. Her long auburn hair hung in tangled strands around her face, and her clothes, a simple white dress that looked like it belonged to another era, were torn and stained with dirt and what looked like blood. Marcus's first instinct was that she was dead. The way she hung limply against the stone monument, her head tilted forward, suggested no signs of life. But as he dismounted and approached cautiously, his flashlight beam trembling in his shaking hand, he saw her chest rise and fall with shallow breaths. She was alive. The grave marker she was bound to belonged to someone named Eleanor Whitmore, who had died in 1847 at the age of 19. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. The girl tied to the stone appeared to be about the same age as the woman buried beneath it. Thick rope bound her wrists behind the monument, and her ankles were similarly secured. Whoever had done this had taken care to ensure she couldn't escape. "Miss?" Marcus called softly, not wanting to startle her. "Can you hear me?" The girl's head lifted slowly, and when their eyes met in the flashlight beam, Marcus felt something shift inside his chest. Her eyes were the color of storm clouds, a deep gray that seemed to hold depths he couldn't fathom. But it wasn't just their color that struck him. It was the ancient quality of her gaze, as if she had seen far more than any 19-year-old should. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind, "don't let them find me here." Marcus immediately began working on the ropes that bound her wrists. They were thick and new, tied with the kind of knots that suggested whoever had done this knew what they were doing. As he worked, he kept glancing over his shoulder, suddenly very aware that whoever had tied her here might still be nearby. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his fingers working frantically at the knots. "How long have you been here?" The girl's eyes darted around the cemetery, fear evident in every line of her face. "They'll come back," she said. "They always come back when the moon is full." Marcus paused in his work, following her gaze to the sky where a nearly full moon was beginning to rise through the bare branches of the oak trees. A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the November cold. "Who will come back?" he pressed, finally managing to loosen the rope around her wrists. Instead of answering, she leaned forward as he moved to untie her ankles, and whispered something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "I know what happened to your brother." Marcus's hands froze on the rope. His brother Danny had disappeared 23 years ago, when Marcus was just 25 and Danny was barely 18. They had been working the ranch together that summer, with Danny planning to head off to college in the fall. One morning, Danny's bed was empty, his truck was gone, and there had been no trace of him since. The police had investigated for months, but eventually the case went cold. Danny Caldwell had simply vanished, as if he had never existed. "What did you say?" Marcus's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. The girl's grey eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made him feel like she was looking straight through to his soul. "Danny Caldwell," she said, "your little brother. I know what they did to him." The rope fell away from her ankles, but Marcus found himself unable to move. For over 2 decades, he had wondered what had happened to Danny. He had driven every back road in 3 counties, had posted flyers until the paper faded and curled, had hired private investigators who had found nothing. The not knowing had eaten away at him, had destroyed his marriage to Sarah, when the obsession with finding his brother consumed every aspect of his life. "That's impossible," Marcus said, though his voice lacked conviction. "You're too young. You would have been just a baby when—" "I wasn't a baby," she interrupted, struggling to stand on legs that shook from being bound for what must have been hours. "I was there. I saw everything." Marcus caught her as she swayed, her body weak, from whatever ordeal she had endured. Up close, he could see that the stains on her dress weren't just dirt and blood. There were symbols drawn in what looked like mud, or worse, strange markings that seemed to shift and blur in the flashlight. "Beam. We need to get you to a hospital," he said, trying to focus on practical matters, even as his mind reeled from her impossible claim. "You need medical attention, and we need to call the police." "No." The sharpness in her voice made him step back. "No police, no hospitals. They're part of it. They've always been part of it." Dakota whinnied nervously from where Marcus had left him, the horse clearly eager to leave this place. Marcus found himself agreeing with the animal's instincts. Whatever was happening here, whatever this girl knew or thought she knew, they needed to be somewhere else when they discussed it. "All right," he said, making a decision that would change everything. "We'll go back to my ranch. You can clean up, get some food, and then you can tell me what you know about Danny." The girl nodded. But as Marcus helped her toward his horse, she glanced back at the grave marker where she had been bound. "Eleanor Whitmore, 1828–1847. Beloved daughter, taken too soon." The same words that could have been carved on Danny's headstone if they had ever found a body to bury. "She was the first," the girl whispered, following Marcus's gaze to the inscription. "But she wasn't the last." Getting the girl onto Dakota proved challenging. She was weak and disoriented, and the horse remained skittish in this place of old bones and older secrets. Marcus had to practically lift her into the saddle before climbing up behind her, his arms around her waist to keep her steady as they made their way out of the cemetery. As they rode through the night toward his ranch, Marcus found himself studying the girl's profile in the moonlight. There was something timeless about her features, something that reminded him of the old daguerreotypes his grandmother had kept in her parlor. The girl looked like she could have stepped out of another century entirely. "What's your name?" he asked as they crossed the cattle guard that marked the boundary of his property. "Lily," she said after a long moment. "Lily Thorne." The name meant nothing to Marcus, but then again, if she was connected to Danny's disappearance, she might not be from around Millfield. His brother had been adventurous, always talking about the places he wanted to see, and the people he wanted to meet. It was possible he had encountered this girl, or her family, somewhere else, Marcus's ranch house came into view, a sprawling, single-story structure that had been in his family for 3 generations. Yellow light spilled from the kitchen windows, and he realized he had forgotten to turn off the lights before heading out to look for his cattle. The sight of home should have been comforting, but with Lily Thorne's impossible claims weighing on his mind, even familiar surroundings felt strange and uncertain. He helped her down from Dakota and led her to the front porch, noting how she moved with a careful grace that suggested recent injury. Once inside, under the bright kitchen lights, he got his first clear look at her condition. The white dress was definitely from another era. The cut and fabric looked like something from a historical reenactment or a very elaborate costume. The stains were worse than he had initially thought, and there were scratches on her arms and face that looked fresh. "There's a bathroom down the hall," Marcus said, pointing toward the back of the house. "Clean towels in the cabinet, and I think there might be some of my ex-wife's clothes still in the guest room closet, if you want to change." Lily nodded, but didn't move toward the bathroom. Instead, she stood in his kitchen, looking around with an expression he couldn't quite read. It was as if she was seeing something he couldn't, or remembering something that had happened in this very room. "Your brother sat right there," she said suddenly, pointing to one of the chairs at his kitchen table. "Last night, anyone saw him alive." Marcus felt the floor seem to shift beneath his feet. Danny had indeed been in this kitchen on his last night. At the ranch, had sat in that exact chair while they planned the next day's work. But there was no way this girl could know that, no way she could have been there. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. How? The word came out strangled, barely recognizable as his own voice. Lily's grey eyes met him across the kitchen, and in them he saw a pain that seemed far too old for someone her age. "Because," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I've been trapped in that cemetery for 23 years waiting for someone to find me. Waiting for someone to believe what I have to tell them about the people who killed your brother and tried to kill me." The kitchen fell silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of wind rattling the windows. Marcus stared at this girl who claimed to hold the answers to questions that had tormented him for over 2 decades, trying to process the impossibility of what she was saying. 23 years. She would have been born after Danny disappeared, would have been a child when the events she claimed to witness took place. But looking at her now, seeing the weight of old trauma in her eyes and the way she carried herself like someone far older than her apparent years, Marcus found himself wanting to believe her despite every rational thought in his head. "That's impossible," he said, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Lily moved to the kitchen table and sat in the chair she had indicated, the same chair where Danny had sat on that last night. She placed her hands flat on the wooden surface, and Marcus noticed that her fingernails were broken and bloody, as if she had been clawing at something for a very long time. "I know how it sounds," she said. "I know what you're thinking. But time works differently in places like that cemetery, especially when you're held there by people who know the old ways. The ways that were practiced long before this town was built, before the first settlers came and thought they could just ignore what was already here." Marcus pulled out another chair and sat across from her, his hands shaking slightly as he processed her words. "What old ways? What are you talking about?" Lily's gaze drifted to the window, where the nearly full moon cast silver light across his backyard. "Your family's ranch," she said. "It's built on sacred ground that was used for ceremonies long before your great-grandfather bought this land and decided to raise cattle on it. The people who were here first, they knew how to keep the balance. But when they were driven out, that balance was broken." "You're talking about Native American burial grounds?" Marcus asked. "Because if that's the case, there are laws." Not burial grounds, Lily interrupted. Sacrifice grounds, places where the barrier between worlds is thin, where blood offerings were made to keep certain doors closed. Your great-grandfather built his ranch house right on top of the most sacred spot, and every generation since has paid the price. Marcus thought about his family's history on this land. His great-grandfather had indeed been one of the first settlers in the area, had claimed a vast stretch of territory and built it into a prosperous ranch. But Marcus's grandfather had died young in a farming accident, and his father had struggled with alcoholism before dying of liver failure at 55. Marcus himself had never been able to make the ranch truly profitable, had watched his marriage fall apart, and had lost his only brother to mysterious circumstances. "Even if what you're saying is true," Marcus said slowly, "what does any of this have to do with Danny? And how could you possibly know about it if you've been tied to that grave marker for 23 years? Lily stood and moved to the kitchen sink, looking out the window toward the back of the property where the old barn stood silhouetted against the night sky. "Because the people who took your brother, they're the same ones who tried to sacrifice me. They're descendants of the original settlers, people who learned just enough of the old ways to be dangerous, but not enough to understand what they were really dealing with." She turned back to face him, and in the kitchen light, Marcus could see that her eyes held flecks of gold that seemed to shimmer like firelight. "They've been trying to appease what your great-grandfather disturbed ever since he built this place. Animal sacrifices at first, then people when the animals weren't enough. Your brother wasn't their first victim, and I wasn't supposed to be their last." The rational part of Marcus's mind rebelled against everything she was saying. It sounded like something out of an old horror movie, too fantastical to be real. But the pain in her eyes was genuine, and the specific details about Danny's last night were things no one outside the family could have known. "Who are they?" he asked. "These people who supposedly killed my brother." Lily returned to the table, sitting down heavily, as if the conversation was draining what little strength she had left. "The Blackwood family owns the mortuary in town. The Ashfords run the sheriff's department. The Whitmore descendants control the bank and most of the local businesses. They're all connected, all part of the same bloodline that's been trying to maintain control over this area for generations." Marcus knew all those names. Jim Blackwood had handled his father's funeral. Sheriff Tom Ashford had been the one to investigate Danny's disappearance, and Victoria Whitmore held the mortgage on his ranch, having been pressuring him to sell for years as his financial situation worsened. "You're saying they're all in on some kind of conspiracy?" Marcus asked. "That they killed Danny as part of some occult ritual?" "Not a conspiracy," Lily corrected. "A family tradition. They believe that by making blood offerings on your land, they can control the supernatural forces that your great-grandfather unleashed when he built here. But they don't understand that each sacrifice only makes things worse, only feeds the darkness instead of appeasing it." She reached across the table and took his hand, her skin cold despite the warmth of the kitchen. "Your brother figured it out. He found old documents in the town historical society, records that had been hidden away for decades. He came to you that last night because he was planning to expose them, to bring in outside authorities who weren't connected to the local families." Marcus remembered that last conversation with Danny, remembered his brother's excitement about something he had discovered, his plans to drive into the county seat the next morning to meet with someone important. At the time, Marcus had assumed it was about a job opportunity or maybe a girl. He'd been too focused on ranch work to pay close attention to what Danny was really saying. "He never made it to that meeting," Marcus said quietly. "No," Lily agreed. "They took him that night, right from his truck as he was leaving the ranch. I was already their prisoner by then, had been held in that cemetery for weeks while they prepared for the full moon ceremony. They brought Danny there, to Eleanor Whitmore's grave, because she was their ancestor and they believed her spirit would lend power to their ritual. The wind outside picked up, rattling the windows and sending tree branches scraping against the side of the house. Both Marcus and Lily looked toward the sound, and Marcus noticed that her entire body had tensed at the noise. "They're looking for me," she said. "They know I'm gone by now, and they'll come here eventually. This land calls to them, especially during the full moon." Marcus stood and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. His property stretched for miles in every direction, with plenty of places for someone to hide and watch the house. The thought that people might be out there, people who had killed his brother and tortured this girl, made his skin crawl. "We should call the state police," he said. "Get someone out here who isn't connected to the local families you mentioned." "They won't believe us," Lily said. "And even if they did, what proof do we have? My word against families that have controlled this town for generations. They'll say I'm mentally ill, that you're a grief-stricken man clinging to conspiracy theories." About his dead brother, Marcus knew she was right, but the alternative, accepting that he was harboring a girl who claimed to have been supernaturally preserved in a cemetery for over 2 decades, seemed even less believable. "Then what do you suggest we do?" he asked. Lily stood and moved to the kitchen drawer, pulling it open with the familiarity of someone who had been in this house before. She withdrew a sharp knife, testing its edge against her thumb. A drop of blood welled up, bright red against her pale skin. "We finish what your brother started," she said. "We find the proof he gathered, and we expose them. But first we survive until morning." As if summoned by her words, the sound of vehicles approaching echoed across the ranch. Marcus moved to the front window and saw headlights cutting through the darkness, at least 3 vehicles heading up his long driveway. "They're here," Lily whispered, moving to stand beside him at the window. Marcus watched the approaching lights and felt something settle inside him, a calm determination that surprised him with its strength. For 23 years, he had wondered what happened to his brother. Now, with answers finally within reach, he wasn't about to let Danny's killers silence the only witness to his murder. "Then we'd better get ready," he said, reaching for the shotgun he kept mounted above the fireplace. The vehicles were getting closer, their headlights now illuminating the front yard. Through the glare, Marcus could make out the shapes of at least 6 people moving toward his house. People who moved with the confidence of those who had never been challenged on their own territory. But this was Marcus's territory now, and he had spent 30 years learning every inch of it. If these people wanted a fight, he would give them one they wouldn't forget. Lily moved to stand beside him, the kitchen knife glinting in her hand. "Whatever happens," she said, "don't let them take me back to that cemetery. I'd rather die here than spend another night tied to that grave marker." Marcus chambered around in his shotgun and moved toward the front door. "Nobody's taking you anywhere," he said. "It's time these people answered for what they did to my brother." The headlights stopped just outside his front porch, and Marcus could hear car doors slamming and voices conferring in hushed tones. Soon they would make their move, and he would finally have the chance to confront Danny's killers face to face. But as he positioned himself by the front window, shotgun ready, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this confrontation was only the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous than he could possibly imagine. Marcus killed the lights throughout the house, plunging them into darkness just as heavy footsteps reached his front porch. Through the window, he could see the silhouettes of 6 figures spreading out around his property with military precision. These weren't random criminals or desperate cultists. They moved like people who had done this many times before. "Back door," Lily whispered, grabbing his arm. "And they'll have someone there too, but there's a root cellar behind the kitchen that connects to the old storm tunnels your great-grandfather built. I've seen the blueprints." Marcus stared at her in the darkness. "How could you possibly know about those tunnels? They've been sealed for decades." "Your brother showed me the day before they took him," she said, already moving toward the kitchen. He found the original construction documents when he was researching the property's history. He thought they might be useful if anyone ever came after him. A sharp knock echoed from the front door, followed by a voice Marcus recognized with a chill of dread. "Marcus Caldwell, this is Sheriff Ashford. We need to talk to you about a missing person." Tom Ashford had been sheriff for 15 years, had personally led the investigation into Danny's disappearance. Marcus had trusted him, had believed the man was doing everything possible to find his brother. The thought that Ashford might have been complicit in Danny's murder all along made Marcus's stomach turn. "We know you found something at the cemetery." "Tonight," Ashford continued, "something that doesn't belong to you. We're here to take it back." Lily pressed herself against the kitchen wall, her face pale in the moonlight streaming through the window. "He's talking about me," she whispered. "To them, I'm not a person. I'm property, something they own." The back door handle rattled, confirming Lily's prediction that they had surrounded the house. Marcus counted at least 8 distinct voices now, more people than he had initially seen in the vehicles. They must have been waiting in the darkness around his property, watching and planning. "Where's this root cellar?" Marcus asked, following Lily toward the back of the kitchen. She knelt beside what looked like a section of ordinary flooring and pressed against a specific board. To Marcus's amazement, a 3-foot square section of the floor lifted on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow ladder descending into blackness below. "Your great-grandfather was paranoid about Indian raids," Lily explained as she descended into the opening. "He built escape routes throughout the house and connected them to natural cave systems that run under this entire area." Marcus followed her down the ladder, pulling the floor section closed above them just as he heard glass breaking somewhere in the house. They had run out of time for subtlety. The space beneath the kitchen was larger than Marcus had expected, clearly hand-excavated and reinforced with timber that had somehow survived nearly a century underground. Lily moved through the darkness with confidence, leading him along a narrow tunnel that sloped downward into the earth. "How is any of this possible?" Marcus asked as they made their way through the underground passage. "How do you know things that happened before you were born? How have you survived 23 years tied to a gravestone?" Lily paused at a junction where their tunnel intersected with a larger natural cave system. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, and Marcus could feel air moving through passages that extended far beyond the reach of their small flashlight. "The night they took your brother," she said, "they performed a binding ritual, not just on him, but on me too. They needed a witness, someone who would remember every detail of what they did. The ritual was supposed to keep me alive indefinitely, trapped at Eleanor Whitmore's grave as a living record of their sacrifice." She turned to face him in the narrow beam of flashlight, and Marcus saw that her eyes held depths that seemed to extend far beyond the physical. But something went wrong with their spell. Instead of just preserving my body, it opened my mind to the history of this place. "I've seen everything that's happened on your land for the past 150 years. Every death, every secret, every lie." They resumed moving through the cave system, following what appeared to be a path worn, smooth by decades of use. Marcus wondered who else might have traveled these tunnels over the years, and whether any of them had been trying to escape the same people who now hunted him and Lily. "The Blackwood, Ashford, and Whitmore families," Lily continued as they walked. "They're not just random settlers who learned some Native American rituals. They're descendants of a specific group that came here in the 1840s, people who were already practicing dark magic before they ever left the East Coast." The tunnel opened into a larger chamber with multiple passages branching off in different directions. Ancient symbols were carved into the stone walls, and Marcus could see the remains of old campfires and what looked like makeshift altars scattered around the space. "This was a meeting place," Lily explained, following his gaze to the carved symbols. The original inhabitants used it for ceremonies, but when the settlers came, they perverted those rituals for their own purposes. They thought they could control the spiritual forces of this land, use them to guarantee their success and prosperity. Marcus examined the symbols more closely. They seemed to shift and change in the moving beam of his flashlight, creating patterns that made his eyes water. If he looked at them too long, and they've been doing this for over a century longer, Lily said. Eleanor Whitmore wasn't their first victim. She was just the first one they properly documented. There are dozens of graves in that cemetery that don't match the official records. People who disappeared over the years and were buried in unmarked plots after being used in their rituals. A sound echoed through the tunnels behind them. Voices, still distant but definitely following their path. Marcus realized that their pursuers must also know about the underground passages, must have been using them for their own purposes. For years. We need to keep moving, he said, but Lily had stopped at one of the carved walls and was running her fingers over the symbols. Wait, she said. Your brother found something here, something he hid before they caught him. She pressed against a particular carving, and a section of the wall swung inward on concealed hinges, revealing a small cavity behind. Inside the hidden space was a metal box, carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. Marcus lifted it out and opened it, finding a collection of documents, photographs, and what appeared to be audio cassette tapes. Danny's evidence, Lily said. Everything he gathered about the families and their rituals. Birth certificates, death records, financial documents showing how they've controlled the local economy, and recordings of their ceremonies. Marcus rifled through the papers, recognizing his brother's handwriting on notes that detailed connections between the three families going back generations. Bank records showed suspicious transfers of money around the dates of several disappearances. Most damning of all were photographs that appeared to have been taken at night in Willowbrook Cemetery, showing robed figures conducting rituals around fresh graves. This is it, Marcus said. This is enough to bring them down. The voices in. The tunnels were getting closer, and Marcus could now make out individual words. They were arguing about which passage to take, but it was clear they knew the underground system well enough to track their quarry effectively. There's another way out through the old mine shaft, Lily said, leading him toward one of the darker passages. It comes up near the highway, about 2 miles from your house. If we can make it there, we can get to the state police before they catch us. As they hurried through the narrow tunnel, Marcus found himself studying Lily's profile in the bouncing flashlight beam. Despite everything she had told him, despite the impossible nature of her claims, he found himself believing her completely. There was something about her presence, something about the way she moved through these underground spaces that convinced him she was exactly what she claimed to be. The night they took Danny, he said as they climbed through a particularly narrow section of the passage, what exactly did they do to him? Lily was quiet for so long that Marcus thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible above the sound of their movement through the rocks. They brought him to Eleanor's grave just after midnight, she said. I was already tied there, had been for 3 days while they prepared. They made me watch everything, made sure I understood that I was meant to remember every detail. The passage opened into another chamber, this one clearly part of an old mining operation. Rusted equipment lay scattered around, and the walls showed evidence of pick and shovel work from decades past. Danny wasn't afraid at first, Lily continued. He thought they were just trying to scare him, that they would let him go once they realized he hadn't shared his research with anyone else. But when Victoria Whitmore began reading from the old books, when the symbols they had drawn around the grave began to glow, he understood what was really happening. Marcus felt his throat tighten as he imagined his brother's final moments. Did he suffer? He fought, Lily said simply. Even when he realized he couldn't escape, he kept fighting. He made them work for it, made it harder for them to complete their ritual properly. That's part of why their spell on me went wrong. Danny's resistance disrupted their concentration. They reached a rusted ladder that led upward toward what Marcus hoped was the surface. As Lily began to climb, he heard something that made his blood run cold, the sound of multiple people entering the mining chamber behind them. "They're here," he whispered. Lily looked down at him from several rungs up the ladder. "The ritual they performed that night," she said urgently. "It wasn't just about Danny. They were trying to open a permanent gateway, something that would give them direct access to the dark forces they've been serving. Danny's death was meant to be the final key." Marcus began climbing after her, the metal box of evidence tucked securely under his arm. Below them, flashlight beams were beginning to probe the chamber, and he could hear Sheriff Ashford's voice directing the search. "But the ritual failed?" Marcus asked as they climbed. "Not failed," Lily corrected. "Delayed. They need both of us. Danny's blood, which they preserved, and my life force, which has been building power for 23 years. Tonight was supposed to be the completion of what they started." They reached the top of the shaft, emerging into a small structure that had once housed mining equipment. Through broken windows, Marcus could see they were indeed near the highway, with the lights of passing trucks visible in the distance. "So, what happens now?" Marcus asked, as they prepared to leave the shelter of the mining building. "How do we stop them permanently?" Lily looked back toward the direction of his ranch, where lights were now visible in the darkness, their pursuers' vehicles, and probably more arriving as backup. "Your brother figured that out too," she said, pulling one of the cassette tapes from the metal box. "He recorded one of their ceremonies, but more importantly, he recorded the counter-ritual that can close the gateway they've been trying to open. The original inhabitants left instructions hidden in the symbols carved throughout these cave systems." Marcus stared at the tape in her hand. "You're saying we can actually stop them, permanently?" "We can do more than that," Lily said, her grey eyes reflecting the distant highway lights. "We can turn their own ritual against them, use the power they've been building to banish the dark forces they serve, and free everyone who's been trapped by their magic." The sound of people climbing the ladder below them spurred them into motion. They left the mining structure and began making their way across the rough terrain toward the highway, the metal box of evidence their only hope of bringing justice for Danny and the countless other victims. As they ran through the darkness, Marcus found himself thinking about his brother's final night, about the courage Danny had shown in trying to expose these people. Now, 23 years later, Marcus had the chance to finish what Danny had started. But first, they had to survive long enough to use the evidence they carried. Behind them, more flashlight beams were emerging from the mining structure, and Marcus could hear the sound of vehicles starting up back at his ranch. Their pursuers were coordinating a manhunt using resources and knowledge built up over generations of controlling this territory. "The highway," Lily said, pointing toward the distant lights. "If we can flag down a trucker, someone from outside the area, we might have a chance." They reached the edge of the highway just as a semi-truck was approaching. Marcus stepped into the roadway, waving his arms and shouting, hoping desperately that the driver would stop and not simply swerve around what might appear to be a madman in the middle of the night. The truck's brakes hissed as it slowed. Air. Brakes engaging with a sound that was the most beautiful thing Marcus had ever heard. The driver, a middle-aged woman with graying hair, rolled down her window and looked at them with concern. "You folks having car trouble?" she asked. "Please," Marcus said, "we need to get to the state police. People are trying to kill us." The driver's expression shifted from concern to alarm as she took in their appearance. Marcus still carrying his shotgun, Lily in her torn and stained dress, both of them covered in dirt from their journey through the underground passages. "Get in," she said, unlocking the passenger door. "I'll take you wherever you need to go." As they climbed into the truck's cab, Marcus looked back toward his ranch and saw multiple sets of headlights converging on the area where they had emerged. From the mine, they had escaped, but barely. "Thank you," he said to the driver as she pulled back onto the highway. "I'm Marcus Caldwell, and this is Lily Thorne. We have evidence of multiple murders that go back decades." The driver, who introduced herself as Janet Morrison, listened with growing amazement as Marcus gave her an abbreviated version of their story. By the time they reached the state police barracks 40 miles away, she was fully convinced that she had picked up two people who desperately needed official protection. "I've been driving these roads for 20 years, Janet said as they pulled into the parking lot. "Always thought there was something strange about that area around Millfield. Too many accidents, too many people who just disappeared. Maybe now someone will finally do something about it." As they walked toward the state police building, Lily suddenly stopped and grabbed Marcus's arm. "Wait," she said. "Before we go in there, you need to understand something. Once we start this process, once we turn over Danny's evidence, there's no going back. These families have connections everywhere, and they'll do anything to protect their secrets." Marcus looked at the building in front of them, thinking about the comfortable life he had been living just hours before. His ranch, his routine, his quiet existence, all of that was about to end forever. "My brother died trying to expose them," he said finally. "I can't do any less." Lily nodded, her hand tightening on his arm. "Then let's finish what Danny started." As they approached the entrance to the state police building, Marcus felt the weight of the metal box under his arm and thought about the cassette tape that supposedly contained the key to ending the family's reign of terror. In a few hours, the sun would rise on what he hoped would be a very different world. But first, they had to convince the authorities that their incredible story was true. And somewhere behind them, in the darkness around Millfield, the descendants of the original settlers were undoubtedly planning their next move. The real battle was just beginning. Detective Sarah Chen had seen her share of strange cases during her 15 years with the Texas State Police, but nothing had prepared her for the two people who walked into the barracks at 3 in the morning, carrying a metal box and claiming to have evidence of a century-old conspiracy. Marcus Caldwell looked like he'd been through hell, dirt-stained, exhausted, clutching a shotgun and speaking in the rapid, urgent tones of someone who expected to be dismissed as a lunatic. The young woman with him was even more peculiar. Lily Thorne appeared to be in her early 20s, but carried herself with an otherworldly composure that made Chen's instincts prickle with unease. "Let me understand this correctly," Chen said, sitting across from them in the interview room, after they'd laid out their initial claims. "You're alleging that prominent families in Millfield have been conducting ritual murders for over a century, that they killed your brother 23 years ago, and that Miss Thorne here has been supernaturally preserved as a witness to these crimes." Marcus opened the metal box and spread Danny's research across the table. "Look at the evidence before you decide we're crazy. Bank records, death certificates, photographs of their ceremonies. My brother spent months documenting their activities before they murdered him." Chen examined the documents, her trained eye immediately recognizing the authenticity of the official records. The financial documents showed suspicious patterns, large cash transfers between the Blackwood, Ashford and Whitmore families that coincided with reported disappearances dating back to the 1920s. The photographs were more disturbing, showing robed figures conducting what appeared to be occult rituals in a cemetery setting. "These bank records," Chen said, "they show transactions that would require cooperation from multiple financial institutions. And these death certificates..." She held up several documents that showed discrepancies between reported causes of death and what the coroner had privately noted in his files. Lily leaned forward, her grey eyes fixed on Chen with unnerving intensity. "Detective, how long have you been working in this region?" 15 years, Chen replied, wondering where the question was leading. "In that time, how many missing persons cases have originated from the Millfield area compared to similar-sized communities?" Chen paused, realizing she had never considered the statistics in that light. I'd have to check the exact numbers, but... She trailed off, memory supplying images of case files that had always bothered her. Too many people who had simply vanished, without a trace, investigations that had stalled when they reached certain local officials. The Ashford family has controlled the sheriff's department for 3 generations, Marcus said. Every investigation that gets close to the truth gets buried or misdirected. That's how they've operated for so long. Chen picked up one of the cassette tapes from the box. What's on these? Recordings of their ceremonies, Lily said. Your brother was very thorough. He documented not just the financial and administrative evidence, but actual audio of them performing their rituals. Chen looked at the tape in her hand, then at the vintage recorder Marcus had brought from the evidence box. You want me to listen to recordings that you claim prove supernatural activities are taking place in Millfield? I want you to listen to recordings of people confessing to multiple murders, Marcus corrected. The supernatural element is secondary to the fact that they're killers. Chen inserted the first tape into the recorder and pressed play. What emerged from the speakers made her blood run cold. Voices she recognized: Sheriff Tom Ashford, Victoria Whitmore from the bank, Jim Blackwood from the mortuary, discussing the details of what they called the harvest, with the casual tone of people planning a business meeting. The Caldwell boy has become a problem, Ashford's voice said through the static. He's found too much, connected too many dots. We need to move up the timeline. The binding is nearly ready, came Victoria Whitmore's voice. The girl has been prepared for 3 days. If we take the boy tonight, we can complete the gateway ritual before the moon begins to wane. Chen stopped the tape, her hands shaking. Slightly, she had worked with Tom Ashford on dozens of cases over the years, had considered him a competent and honest law enforcement officer. Hearing his voice casually discussing murder was like discovering that gravity had reversed itself. There are 6 more tapes, Lily said quietly. Each one contains evidence of specific crimes going back decades. Names, dates, locations, everything your brother gathered during his investigation. Chen looked at the documents spread across the table with new eyes. If the recordings were authentic, and her experience told her they were, then she was looking at evidence of a conspiracy that would reshape everything she thought she knew about law enforcement in this region. We need to contact the FBI, Chen said, reaching for her phone. This is beyond state jurisdiction now. No, Lily said sharply, her hand shooting out to stop Chen from dialing. Not yet. They have connections in federal agencies too. People who've been compromised or recruited over the years. If you contact the wrong person, we'll all disappear before morning. Chen studied Lily's face, noting the absolute certainty in her expression. How could you possibly know about federal connections? You claim to have been tied to a gravestone for 23 years. The ritual they performed didn't just preserve my body, Lily explained. It opened my mind to the spiritual history of this entire region. I've seen their network expand over the decades, watched them place their people in positions of power throughout state and federal agencies. Marcus pulled out a manila folder from the bottom of the evidence box. Danny documented some of those connections too. Look at this. The folder contained personnel records and family trees showing relationships between the Millfield families and various government officials. Chen recognized several names: a federal judge whose mother had been a Whitmore, an FBI field office supervisor whose grandfather had been an Ashford. Even if some of these connections are legitimate, Chen said, we can't just assume everyone is compromised. There have to be clean channels we can use. There are, Lily agreed, but we need to be very careful about who we trust. And we need to move quickly before they realize how much evidence we have. Chen stood and began pacing the small interview room. Assuming everything you've told me is true, what exactly are you proposing we do? We can't arrest an entire network. of conspirators without proper support and coordination. We don't need to arrest them, Lily said. We need to stop them. There's a difference. Marcus looked at her sharply. What do you mean? Lily pulled out the final cassette tape, one that looked older and more worn than the others. This isn't a recording of their ceremonies. It's your brother's documentation of the counter-ritual he discovered, the process that can permanently close the gateway they've been trying to open and break the supernatural bonds that have protected them for generations. Chen stopped pacing. You're talking about conducting some kind of occult ritual yourselves. I'm talking about using their own methods against them, Lily clarified. The original inhabitants of this land left specific instructions for containing the dark forces that the settler families have been manipulating. Danny found those instructions and figured out how to implement them. This is insane, Chen said, but even as she spoke the words, she found herself considering the possibility. The evidence was overwhelming, the recordings were damning, and her own experience had taught her that reality was often stranger than logic suggested. Marcus leaned forward in his chair. Detective, 6 hours ago I was a simple rancher looking for missing cattle. Now I'm sitting here with evidence that my brother was murdered by people I've known my entire life. People who've been getting away with killing innocent victims for over a century. If there's a way to stop them permanently, I'm willing to try it. Chen looked at the evidence spread across the table, then at the two people who had brought it to her. Everything in her training told her to follow proper procedure, to build a case through conventional channels and trust the system to deliver justice. But the scope of the conspiracy they had uncovered suggested that conventional channels might be exactly what their enemies were counting on. What would this counter-ritual involve? She asked. Lily stood and moved to the window, looking out at the pre-dawn darkness. It has to be performed at the source of their power, the site where your great-grandfather built his ranch house. And it has to be done during the full moon, which means we have less than 24 hours. You want to go back there? Marcus asked. They'll be watching my property, waiting for us to return. And they'll be expecting us to run, to try to hide or seek help from outside authorities, Lily said. They won't expect us to come back and challenge them directly on their own ground. Chen found herself drawn into their planning despite her better judgment. How many people are we talking about? How large is their organization? Marcus consulted Danny's notes. The core families probably have about 20 active members, but they've recruited others over the years. Local police, county officials, people in the business community, maybe 50 or 60 people total who are directly involved. Against the three of us, Chen said dryly. Against the truth, Lily corrected, and against forces they don't fully understand. They've been using borrowed power for generations, power that was never meant for them. The counter-ritual will turn that power back on itself. Chen walked to her desk and pulled out a detailed map of the region around Millfield. Show me exactly where we'd need to go and what we'd need to do. For the next hour, they planned what Chen could only describe as the most unconventional operation of her career. Using Danny's research and Lily's supernatural knowledge, they developed a strategy that combined conventional law enforcement tactics with elements that belonged more in a horror novel than a police report. The ritual has to begin at the exact moment of moonrise, Lily explained, tracing locations on the map, and it requires specific actions at 3 different sites: the ranch house where the gateway is strongest, Eleanor Whitmore's grave where the original binding was performed, and the ceremonial chamber in the cave system where they've been conducting their sacrifices. How are 3 people supposed to be in 3 different places at the same time? Chen asked. We're not going to be alone, Marcus said, looking up from a list he'd been making. There are people in Millfield who've suspected something was wrong. For years, families of missing persons who never believed the official explanations. If we approach them carefully, we might be able to build a team. Chen considered the risks involved in expanding their circle of trust. That's assuming they believe us, and assuming none of them are connected to the families we're targeting. Danny's research includes psychological profiles of potential allies, Lily said, pulling out another folder. People who've been harmed by the conspiracy, but who've never had the evidence to act on their suspicions. Chen reviewed the list of names, recognizing several from missing persons cases she had worked on over the years. Some of these people... She paused, remembering the frustration in their eyes when investigations had stalled. They deserved to know the truth. As dawn approached, Chen found herself committed to a course of action that would either expose one of the largest criminal conspiracies in Texas history or destroy her career and possibly her life. But looking at the evidence Danny Caldwell had died trying to preserve, she knew they had to try. "We'll need weapons," she said, her training taking over as she began to plan the operation in earnest. "And we'll need a way to document everything, in case we don't survive to testify about what we find." Marcus nodded toward his shotgun. "I'm covered. What about backup from other state police units?" "Too risky until we know who we can trust," Chen said. "But I can arrange for dead man switches. Evidence packages that get automatically delivered to multiple agencies if we don't check in at specified times." Lily was studying the cassette tape that contained the counter-ritual instructions. "There's something else you both need to understand. Once we begin this process, there's no guarantee any of us will survive it. The forces we're dealing with don't distinguish between guilty and innocent. If the ritual fails, if we make mistakes in the implementation, the supernatural backlash could kill everyone in a 50-mile radius." Chen felt a chill run down her spine. "Are you saying we could accidentally cause a disaster worse than what we're trying to prevent?" "I'm saying that power always comes with a price," Lily said. "The families have been paying that price for generations with other people's lives. If we're going to stop them, we have to be willing to risk our own." Marcus stood and gathered the evidence back into the metal box. "Then we'd better make sure we do this right. Danny died believing it was possible to stop them. I'm not going to let his sacrifice be meaningless." As they prepared to leave the state police barracks, Chen realized that she was about to embark on an operation that would test everything she believed about law, justice, and the nature of reality itself. But looking at the evidence of decades of unpunished murders, she knew that conventional approaches had failed the victims of this conspiracy. "One last question," she said as they reached the door. "If this counter-ritual works, if we manage to stop them permanently, what happens to you, Lily? If your preservation is tied to their magic, won't break their power?" Lily smiled for the first time since Marcus had found her tied to the gravestone. "Free me, detective. After 23 years of being trapped between life and death, I'm ready for whatever comes next." As they walked out into the early morning sunlight, Chen couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to discover just how thin the line between reality and nightmare really was. But with the sun rising on what might be their last day alive, she found herself oddly at peace with the choice they had made. The truth, no matter how strange or terrible, was worth fighting for. And somewhere in Millfield, the families who had built their power on a foundation of murder and fear were about to learn that their century of impunity was finally coming to an end. The abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Millfield had been chosen specifically because it sat on neutral ground, property that predated the arrival of the settler families and remained untouched by their influence. As Chen pulled her unmarked vehicle into the loading dock, she counted 7 other cars already parked in the shadows. Marcus emerged from behind a stack of shipping containers, followed by people Chen recognized from Danny's list of potential allies. Maria Santos, whose teenage son had vanished 3 years ago. Robert Hayes, whose wife had disappeared on her way home from work in 1998. Jennifer Phillips, whose father had been found dead under suspicious circumstances after questioning. irregularities in the town's financial records. "Thank you all for coming," Marcus said as the group gathered in the center of the warehouse. "I know this sounds impossible, but we have proof of what's been happening in this town." Chen set up a portable audio system and began playing selected portions of the recordings. As the voices of Sheriff Ashford, Victoria Whitmore, and Jim Blackwood filled the warehouse space, she watched the faces of the assembled families transform from skepticism to horror to rage. "That's Tom Ashford talking about killing my son," Maria Santos said, her voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "Talking about it like it was a business decision." Robert Hayes stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. "How long has this been going on? How many people have they murdered?" Lily moved to the center of the group, and Chen noticed how the others seemed drawn to her presence despite her young appearance. There was something about her that commanded attention, an authority that came from having witnessed decades of suffering. "The killings began in 1847, Lily said. "Eleanor Whitmore was the first documented victim, but there were others before her whose deaths were never recorded. In the past century and a half, they've taken at least 200 lives. Jennifer." Phillips pulled out a notebook and began writing frantically. "I'm documenting everything. If we don't survive this, people need to know what we discovered." Chen spread a detailed map of the area across a makeshift table. "According to Danny's research, their power is centered on 3 specific locations. The ranch house sits on the primary gateway. Eleanor's grave is where they perform their binding rituals, and the ceremonial chamber in the cave system is where they store the spiritual energy they've accumulated. The counter-ritual requires simultaneous actions at all 3 sites," Marcus added. "We'll need to split into teams and coordinate our timing precisely." David Chen, a geology professor whose sister had disappeared in 1992, studied the map with professional interest. "These cave systems," he said, "they're part of a natural limestone formation that extends throughout this region. The original inhabitants would have recognized their spiritual significance immediately, which is exactly why the settler families chose this area," Lily explained. "They weren't looking for good farmland or water access. They were looking for a place where the barrier between worlds was already thin, where their rituals would have maximum effect." Chen checked her watch. They had 8 hours until moonrise, and the teams still needed to position themselves and prepare the ritual components. "Let's go over the assignments one more time." Marcus would lead the team to the ranch house, accompanied by Maria Santos and Robert Hayes. Their job was to disrupt the primary gateway using a combination of salt circles, iron stakes, and specific incantations that Danny had transcribed from the cave carvings. Chen herself would take Jennifer Phillips and David Chen to Eleanor's grave, where they would need to break the binding that had preserved Lily for 23 years and prevented the souls of other victims from finding peace. Lily would venture into the ceremonial chamber alone, despite everyone's protests. "The cave system recognizes me," she had explained. "I've been connected to its spiritual energy for decades. I'm the only one who can safely navigate the deeper passages and complete the ritual at its source." "What if something goes wrong?" Maria Santos asked. "What if they detect what we're doing before we can finish?" "They will detect it," Lily said matter-of-factly. "The moment we begin disrupting their power base, every member of their organization will feel it. They'll converge on all 3 locations simultaneously." Chen pulled out the weapons she had secured from the state police armory. "Which is why we're going in prepared for a fight. These aren't just cultists we're dealing with. They're people who've been getting away with murder for generations. They won't give up without violence." Robert Hayes examined the tactical gear Chen had provided. "I spent 4 years in the army. If these people killed my wife, I'm ready to make them pay for it." As the group made final preparations, Chen found herself studying Lily with growing fascination. The young woman moved with purpose and confidence. But there was something ethereal about her presence, as if she existed slightly out of phase with the rest of them. "Lily," Chen said, drawing her aside, "what you said about the ritual freeing you, what exactly does that mean?" Lily's grey eyes met hers with an expression of profound sadness. "I've been suspended between life and death for 23 years, Detective. When the binding is broken, when the gateway is sealed, I'll finally be able to move on to whatever comes after this existence." "You're talking about dying," Chen said. "I'm talking about being released from a curse that was never meant to last this long," Lily corrected. "My spirit has been anchored to this place, forced to witness horror after horror while being unable to act. Tonight, I finally get the chance to do something meaningful with the time I've been given." Chen felt a weight settle in her chest. Over the past day, she had come to respect Lily's strength and wisdom, had begun to think of her as a partner rather than just a witness. The idea of losing her was unexpectedly painful. "There has to be another way," Chen said. "Some variation of the ritual that doesn't require your sacrifice." Lily shook her head. "The magic that preserved me was powered by the deaths of innocent people. To break it properly, to ensure it can never be used again, requires a willing sacrifice from someone who has been touched by that same magic. It's the only way to balance the scales." Marcus approached them, having overheard the conversation. "Danny would never have wanted this. He was trying to save people, not get them killed." "Your brother understood the price from the beginning," Lily said gently. "Why do you think he hid the evidence so carefully? Why do you think he included such detailed instructions for the counter-ritual? He knew someone would eventually have to make this choice." The late afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the warehouse windows, creating long shadows that reminded everyone of the approaching deadline. Chen gathered the teams for final coordination. "Radio check every 30 minutes, she said, distributing the communication equipment. "If any team encounters serious resistance, the others need to know immediately. And remember, the ritual components have to be deployed in exact sequence. Too early or too late, and the entire operation fails." Maria Santos loaded ammunition into her pistol with practiced efficiency. "My son was 16 when they took him, 16 years old with his whole life ahead of him. I've been waiting 3 years for the chance to make them pay." "This isn't about revenge," Chen cautioned. "This is about justice and preventing future victims. We stay focused on the mission." "Justice and revenge aren't mutually exclusive," Robert Hayes said grimly. "Sometimes they're the same thing." As the teams prepared to leave for their assigned positions, David Chen pulled out a small device that looked like a combination GPS, unit, and electromagnetic sensor. "I've modified this to detect the kind of energy fluctuations Danny described in his notes. If the ritual is working, we should see measurable changes in the electromagnetic field around all 3 sites." Jennifer Phillips finished loading film into her camera. "I'm documenting everything. Win or lose, people need to know what happened here tonight." Chen checked her service weapon one final time, then looked around at the assembled group. These weren't trained law enforcement officers or military personnel. They were ordinary people who had been pushed beyond their limits by loss and injustice, who had decided that truth was worth risking their lives for. "Before we separate," she said, "I want everyone to understand what we're attempting here. We're not just trying to stop a criminal organization. According to everything we've learned, we're trying to close a supernatural gateway that has been feeding on human suffering for over a century." "Science doesn't matter," Marcus said. "What matters is that people have been dying, and tonight we have the chance to stop it permanently." Lily moved to the center of the group one final time. "Each of you has lost someone to these families. Tonight, you have the chance to ensure that no one else will have to experience that loss. But once we begin, there's no turning back. The forces we're dealing with don't forgive interruption. As the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, the teams began moving toward their vehicles. Chen felt the weight of command settling on her shoulders as she realized that she was leading civilian volunteers into a confrontation that could easily result in all of their deaths. "Detective," Lily said as Chen prepared to leave for Eleanor's. "Grave. When this is over, when the gateway is sealed and the family's power is broken, make sure people remember why it was necessary. Make sure they understand that sometimes ordinary people have to do extraordinary things to protect the innocent." Chen nodded, understanding that Lily was saying goodbye. "I'll make sure your sacrifice means something." "It already does," Lily said with a smile that seemed to light up the warehouse. "For the first time in 23 years, I feel truly alive." As the teams departed for their assigned positions, Chen found herself thinking about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. 12 hours ago, she had been a skeptical detective processing what seemed like an impossible story. Now she was leading an operation that combined elements of law enforcement, military tactics, and supernatural ritual. The radio crackled to life as Marcus's team reported their arrival at the ranch. "Ranch team in position, beginning preliminary. Set up. Cave team departing warehouse," Lily's voice followed. "ETA 20 minutes to ceremonial chamber." Chen keyed her own radio as they approached Willowbrook Cemetery. "Grave team approaching target location. All teams, remember, simultaneous execution at moonrise. No one moves early, no matter what happens." As they parked outside the cemetery gates, Chen could see lights moving in the distance, vehicles converging on the area from multiple directions. The families had indeed detected their presence and were mobilizing their resources. "They're coming," Jennifer Phillips observed, her camera already documenting the approaching threat. "Then we'd better work fast," Chen replied, leading her team toward Eleanor Whitmore's grave. The next few hours would determine whether a century of murder and corruption would finally come to an end, or whether the darkness that had fed on this community for generations would claim new victims. But as Chen knelt beside the weathered gravestone and began arranging the ritual components Danny had specified, she felt a certainty that transcended fear. Tonight, the dead would finally have their justice. And somewhere in the ceremonial chamber beneath the earth, Lily Thorne was preparing to complete a journey that had begun 23 years ago with her brother's courage and would end with her own sacrifice. The moon was rising, and the final confrontation was about to begin. The moon broke the horizon. As Chen knelt beside Eleanor Whitmore's grave, her hands steady despite the chaos erupting around them. Gunfire echoed from the direction of Marcus's ranch, while strange lights pulsed from the cave system where Lily had descended into the ceremonial chamber. "Iron stakes positioned," Jennifer Phillips reported, her voice tight with concentration, as she documented each step of the ritual. "Salt circle complete." David Chen monitored his modified detector, watching electromagnetic readings spike beyond anything he had ever recorded. "The energy levels are off the charts. Whatever's happening, it's affecting the entire geological structure of this area." Detective Chen began reciting the incantations Danny had transcribed, ancient words that felt foreign on her tongue but seemed to resonate with power that made the air itself vibrate. As she spoke, the temperature around Eleanor's grave began to drop noticeably. Through her radio, she could hear Marcus's team under assault. Multiple vehicles approaching the ranch house. His voice crackled through static that seemed to increase with each word of the ritual. "We've got maybe 10 minutes before they overrun our position." "Hold your ground," Chen responded, never pausing in the incantation. "The binding has to be broken completely before we can proceed to the next phase." The ground beneath Eleanor's grave began to tremble, and a low humming sound emerged from somewhere deep in the earth. Jennifer's camera captured what appeared to be wisps of light rising from the grave marker itself, ghostly forms that took on increasingly human shapes. "Jesus Christ," David breathed, his scientific mind struggling to process what his instruments were recording. There are at least 50 distinct energy signatures emerging from the gravesite. Chen realized they were witnessing the spirits of the family's victims, souls that had been bound to this place for generations and were finally being released. Among them, she could make out the translucent figure of a young man who bore a striking resemblance to Marcus. "Danny," she whispered, recognizing him from old photographs. The spirit of Danny Caldwell turned toward her, his mouth moving in words she couldn't hear, but somehow understood. "Finish it." The radio erupted with overlapping transmissions as all three teams reported supernatural phenomena. From the ranch house, Marcus's voice came through amid the sound of gunfire. "The gateway is opening on its own. The ground is splitting apart, and there's light pouring out that doesn't belong to this world." Lily's voice followed, barely audible through increasing static. "The ceremonial chamber is responding to the disruption. The accumulated power of decades is being released all at once. I can see the central altar, but there are guardians here, things that aren't entirely human anymore." Chen pressed on with the ritual, even as armed figures began emerging from the tree line around the cemetery. Sheriff Tom Ashford led the group, his face twisted with rage as he recognized what they were attempting. "Stop what you're doing!" Ashford shouted, raising his weapon. "You have no idea what forces you're meddling with." "We know exactly what we're dealing with," Chen replied, completing the final verse of the binding-breaking incantation. "The question is whether you do." The moment the last word left her lips, a shockwave of energy exploded outward from Eleanor's grave. The sheriff and his men were thrown backward, their weapons discharging harmlessly into the air as they tumbled across the cemetery grounds. Jennifer's camera captured the moment when dozens of spirits rose from graves throughout the cemetery. Not just Eleanor's marker, but from unmarked plots scattered among the legitimate burials. Generations of victims finally freed from their supernatural bondage. David's detector went completely haywire, the reading so extreme that the device began smoking in his hands. The electromagnetic pulse just fried every piece of electronic equipment within a quarter-mile radius, he reported. Including our radios. Chen looked toward the ranch house, where flames now rose into the night sky. Without radio contact, she had no way of knowing whether Marcus's team had survived the supernatural eruption. But the ritual had to continue, according to Danny's precise instructions, regardless of casualties. "Phase 2, she announced, pulling out the second set of components from her pack. "We seal Eleanor's grave permanently and redirect the released energy toward the ceremonial chamber." As they worked to complete the sealing ritual, Sheriff Ashford and his men regrouped, but Chen noticed they were moving differently now. Their coordinated precision had been replaced by confusion and fear, as if the supernatural anchor that had guided their actions for generations had suddenly been severed. "They're lost," Jennifer observed, tracking them through her camera lens. "It's like they don't know what they're supposed to be doing anymore." The spirits of the victims had begun moving in a specific direction, flowing like ethereal rivers toward the cave system where Lily was conducting the most dangerous part of the operation. Chen realized that the freed souls were actively participating in the counter-ritual, adding their combined will to the effort to permanently close the gateway. From the direction of the ranch house, she could see figures running through the flames that now engulfed the building. Whether they were Marcus's team or members of the conspiracy, she couldn't tell at this distance. But the supernatural phenomena were intensifying, with strange lights dancing across the entire landscape. Victoria Whitmore emerged from behind. A large mausoleum, her expensive clothing torn and her face streaked with dirt. Unlike Ashford's confused disorientation, she retained the sharp focus of someone who understood exactly what was happening. "You stupid fools," she snarled at Chen's team. "Do you think breaking our bindings will end this? You've just released forces that have been contained for a century and a half. Now nothing can control them." "That's the point," Chen replied, placing the final iron seal over Eleanor's grave. "Your family never controlled those forces. You just borrowed power that was never meant for you, and now it's time to pay the price." The ground around the cemetery began to crack, revealing glimpses of caverns and passages that extended far deeper than any natural formation should. Through these fissures, Chen could see the glow of supernatural fire and catch glimpses of the vast network of spaces where the families had conducted their rituals over the decades. David pointed toward one of the larger openings. "Look at the rock formations. This entire area is honeycombed with chambers. No wonder the original inhabitants considered it sacred ground." Victoria Whitmore pulled out what appeared to be an antique revolver, its metal inscribed with the same symbols they had seen carved throughout the cave system. "Sacred to some, profitable to others. My family has invested too much in this arrangement to let it end now." She fired at Chen, but the bullet seemed to slow in mid-air before dropping harmlessly to the ground. The supernatural energy saturating the area was affecting even basic physics, creating pockets where normal rules no longer applied. "The ritual is protecting us," Jennifer breathed, her camera documenting the impossible sight of a bullet frozen in space. From deep within the earth came a sound unlike anything Chen had ever heard, a combination of human screaming and something far more alien. Lily's voice, transmitted not through radio, but through the spiritual connection that linked all three ritual sites, reached them with urgent intensity. "The Guardians are fighting back. The accumulated power doesn't want to be released. I need more time to reach the central altar." Chen looked around the cemetery, taking inventory of their situation. Ashford and most of his men were incapacitated by confusion and supernatural interference. Victoria Whitmore was neutralized by the protective energy surrounding the ritual site. But more vehicles were approaching from the direction of town, and the supernatural phenomena showed no signs of stabilizing. "We need to buy Lily more time," she decided. "Jennifer, David, can you handle the final phase here?" David nodded grimly, consulting Danny's handwritten instructions. "The sealing requires one more component, blood willingly given by someone who has lost family to their rituals. I qualify, unfortunately." Jennifer checked her camera, making sure she had documented every aspect of the ritual. "I'll make sure the evidence survives, no matter what happens to us." Chen gathered her weapons and prepared to make her way toward the cave system. "I'm going to help Lily complete the ritual at the source. If we can shut down the ceremonial chamber, the entire network of supernatural energy should collapse." As she prepared to leave Eleanor's grave, the spirit of Danny Caldwell appeared directly in front of her. This time, his voice came through clearly despite his translucent form. "Tell my brother," he said, "that he was right to trust you. And tell Lily that her 23 years of suffering weren't in vain." Chen nodded, understanding that she was carrying messages from the dead to the living. "I'll tell them both." She began running toward the cave entrance that had opened near the cemetery's edge, leaving David and Jennifer to complete the final sealing of Eleanor's grave. Behind her, she could hear Victoria Whitmore shouting orders to the newly arrived vehicles, trying to coordinate a final assault on the ritual sites, but the supernatural energy was spreading faster than the conspirators could respond. Streetlights throughout Millfield were flickering and failing, electronic devices were shutting down, and reports were beginning to filter in of strange phenomena affecting the entire county. As Chen descended into the cave system, following the path Lily had taken hours earlier, She realized that the counter-ritual was succeeding beyond their most optimistic expectations. The gateway that had fed on human suffering for generations was finally being forced closed, and the accumulated spiritual energy of decades was being released in a torrent that threatened to reshape the metaphysical landscape of the entire region. Deeper passages were illuminated by the same ghostly light they had seen rising from the graves, but here it was concentrated and intense enough to see by. Ancient symbols carved into the stone walls seemed to pulse with their own inner fire, and the air itself felt charged with power that made her skin tingle. Ahead, she could hear the sounds of conflict, not gunfire, but something that sounded like a battle between forces that existed beyond the physical world. Lily's voice echoed through the passages, chanting in a language that predated any European settlement of this land. Chen pressed forward, driven by the knowledge that everything they had fought for depended on the success of the final phase of Danny's counter-ritual. Behind her, the entrance to the cave system collapsed in a shower of stone and earth, sealing her into the underground labyrinth with whatever supernatural guardians were fighting to preserve the family's source of power. In the distance, she could see a glow that marked the location of the ceremonial chamber. Between her and that destination lay passages filled with shadows that moved independently of any light source, and the growing certainty that not all of them would survive to see the sunrise. But as Chen moved deeper into the heart of the conspiracies, she carried with her the knowledge that they had already succeeded in ways that mattered most. The binding that had trapped generations of victims had been broken. The spirits of the dead had been freed to find peace, and the network of supernatural control that had protected the guilty families for over a century was finally crumbling. Now, all that remained was to ensure that the gateway closed permanently and that the darkness that had fed on this community's suffering could never return. The final confrontation was waiting in the ceremonial chamber ahead, where Lily Thorne was preparing to complete a sacrifice that would balance the scales of justice once and for all. The ceremonial chamber opened before Chen like a cathedral of horror. The vast underground space stretched beyond the reach of the supernatural light that emanated from carved symbols covering every surface. Ancient stone altars stood arranged in precise geometric patterns, their surfaces stained with the evidence of decades of sacrifice. At the center of it all, Lily Thorne stood facing something that Chen's mind struggled to comprehend. The entity before Lily wasn't entirely physical. It shifted between forms, sometimes appearing as a massive shadow with too many limbs, other times taking on the twisted features of the family's ancestors. This was the guardian that had protected, the gateway for generations, fed by the spiritual energy of countless victims. "You're too late," the thing spoke with voices that belonged to the dead. "The binding cannot be undone. Too much power has been invested, too many souls have been claimed. This place belongs to us now." Lily held Danny's final tape recorder in her hands, the device somehow still functioning despite the electromagnetic chaos above ground. "Every binding has a key," she replied, her voice steady despite facing an entity that radiated centuries of accumulated malevolence. "And every key can be turned." Chen moved carefully around the edge of the chamber, trying to understand the layout that Danny's notes had described. The altars weren't random. They formed a pattern that channeled spiritual energy toward a central point where reality appeared thin enough to see through to somewhere else entirely. Through that ethereal window, Chen caught glimpses of a realm that existed parallel to their own, a place where the family's victims had been trapped after death. Their suffering used to fuel the supernatural power that protected the conspiracy. But now, Thanks to the ritual at Eleanor's grave, that prison was beginning to crack. The counter-ritual requires 3 components, Lily explained, as much to Chen as to the guardian entity. The breaking of the binding, which has been accomplished, the freeing of the trapped souls, which is in progress, and the willing sacrifice of someone who has been touched by the same magic that created this abomination. The guardian lunged toward Lily with movements that defied physics, but she stood her ground, pressing play on the tape recorder. Danny's voice filled the chamber, speaking words in the ancient language he had learned from the cave carvings. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The entity recoiled as if burned, its form becoming less stable with each word of the counter-incantation. Around the chamber, the stained altars began to crack, releasing wisps of light that Chen realized were fragments of souls that had been bound there for decades. "The Caldwell boy learned well," the Guardian hissed, its voice now multiplied into a chorus of the damned. "But his knowledge is incomplete. The gateway has roots that extend far deeper than these simple caves. Even if you destroy this chamber, we will rebuild elsewhere." Chen studied the pattern of altars more carefully, remembering David's observations about the geological structure of the area. The limestone formations that honeycombed this region weren't natural. They had been carved and shaped over centuries to create a vast network of connected chambers, all feeding energy to this central location. "Lily," she called out, "the entire cave system is one massive ritual site. Destroying this chamber won't be enough if the network itself remains intact." Lily nodded, never taking her eyes off the guardian entity. "I know, that's why the final phase requires something more than just disrupting their altar. It requires turning their own network against them." She pulled out a small vial, filled with what appeared to be Danny's blood, preserved somehow for 23 years. Blood willingly given in the pursuit of truth. Blood that has been waiting for this moment since the night they murdered him. The Sire. Guardian's form shifted into something more recognizably human. Chen saw flashes of Sheriff Ashford's face, Victoria Whitmore's features, Jim Blackwood's cruel smile. "You think the blood of one idealistic boy can undo generations of careful work? We have fed on the life force of hundreds. One more death will only make us stronger." "Not one more death," Lily corrected, opening the vial. "One willing sacrifice to break the cycle permanently." She poured Danny's blood onto the central altar, and immediately the chamber began to shake. The supernatural light emanating from the carved symbols intensified. But now it pulsed with a different rhythm, one that seemed to resonate with natural forces, rather than the twisted power the families had cultivated. Chen watched in fascination as the network of carved channels that connected the altars began to glow more brightly. The energy that had flowed inward to this central point for over a century was now reversing direction, carrying the light outward through passages that extended throughout the limestone formation. "The reversal is working," Chen breathed, understanding what Lily had accomplished. "You're using their own network to distribute the counter-energy throughout the entire system." The guardian entity was becoming increasingly unstable, its form fragmenting as the spiritual foundation that sustained it began to crumble. "This cannot be. We are eternal. We are bound to this place by covenants written in blood and sealed with death." "Your covenants were built on stolen power," Lily replied, stepping closer to the central altar. "Power that was never meant for you, drawn from sources you never truly understood. And now it's time to return that power to its rightful place." She placed her hands on the altar, and Chen saw the years begin to show on her face. The supernatural preservation that had kept her young was finally breaking down, but instead of aging her to death, it was restoring her to her natural state, that of a 19-year-old girl who had been murdered 23 years ago. "The final component," Lily said, her voice growing fainter as her connection to the physical world began to weaken. "A willing soul, freely given, to guide the released energy back to the realm where it belongs. The Guardian made one last desperate attempt to reach Lily, but its form was now so unstable that it passed through her harmlessly. Around the chamber, the altars were cracking and crumbling as the reversed energy flow destabilized the entire network. Chen felt the ground shifting beneath her feet and realized that the counter-ritual was affecting the physical structure of the cave system itself. The limestone formations that had been carved and shaped to channel supernatural energy were returning to their natural state, which meant the artificial chambers were beginning to collapse. "Lily, we need to get out of here," Chen shouted, but the young woman shook her head. "I can't leave," Lily said, her form becoming as translucent as the spirits they had seen at Eleanor's grave. "Someone has to guide the energy as it returns to where it belongs, someone who has been part of both worlds for 23 years. Through the ethereal window at the center of the chamber, Chen could see the parallel realm where the victims' souls had been trapped. But now it was transforming, becoming a place of peace rather than torment. The spirits of the dead were finally free to move on to whatever came after life, no longer bound to feed the ambitions of their killers. Among them, Chen saw Danny Caldwell one final time. He was standing beside his brother Marcus, who appeared to be unconscious, but alive at the edge of the collapsing ranch house above ground. Danny's spirit leaned down and whispered something to Marcus before turning to wave at Lily. "Tell them," Lily said to Chen, her voice now barely audible, "that the truth was worth waiting for." The chamber filled with blinding light as the last of the accumulated spiritual energy was released. Chen felt herself being lifted and carried by forces beyond her understanding, transported through collapsing passages that reformed themselves around her, delivering her to the surface just as the entire cave system completed its transformation back to natural limestone formations. She emerged into a world that looked fundamentally different from the one she had left hours earlier. The supernatural phenomena that had plagued Millfield for generations were gone, replaced by the normal sounds and sights of a small Texas town in the early hours of morning. Marcus Caldwell sat beside the smoking ruins of his ranch house, cradling something in his hands that Chen recognized as one of Danny's old photographs. He looked up as she approached, his eyes reflecting a piece she hadn't seen there before. "She did it, didn't she?" Marcus asked. "Lily finished what Danny started." Chen nodded, sitting down beside him on what had once been his front porch. "The gateway is closed permanently. The family's power is broken, and the souls of everyone they killed have finally found peace." Around them, the landscape showed evidence of the supernatural battle that had raged through the night. Trees that had stood for decades were uprooted. Buildings showed stress fractures from the electromagnetic pulses, and the cemetery in the distance looked as if it had been completely rearranged. But there was also something cleaner about the air, something lighter about the atmosphere. The oppressive weight that had hung over this area for generations had finally been lifted. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "To the families, to the town, to all the evidence we gathered?" Chen pulled out her backup recording device, one of the few pieces of electronics that had somehow survived the night's events. "Now we finish what you and Lily and Danny started. We make sure everyone knows the truth about what happened here." In the distance, she could see other survivors emerging. From the chaos, Maria Santos was helping Robert Hayes out of the wreckage of a vehicle that had been overturned by supernatural forces. Jennifer Phillips was still clutching her camera, having documented the entire night's events. David Chen was examining rock, formations that had definitely not existed the day before. "The families?" Marcus asked. "Scattered, confused, stripped of the supernatural protection that kept them hidden for generations," Chen replied. Without their network of spiritual power, they're just ordinary criminals. The evidence Danny gathered will be more than enough to ensure they face justice for their crimes. As the sun rose fully above the horizon, Chen found herself thinking about Lily Thorne, who had waited 23 years for the chance to right a terrible wrong. The young woman had given up her existence not just to save future victims, but to ensure that the dead could finally rest in peace. The sound of approaching sirens indicated that the outside world was finally beginning to respond to the night's events. State police, federal agents, emergency responders, all the conventional authorities who would now have to make sense of evidence that defied conventional explanation. But Chen was confident that the truth would prevail. Too many people had witnessed the events, too much evidence had been preserved, and the family's supernatural protection was gone forever. The conspiracy that had controlled Millfield for over a century was finally at an end. Marcus stood and walked to where his truck had somehow survived the night's chaos. "I need to drive out to the cemetery," he said, "to see Eleanor's grave and to say goodbye to Danny properly." Chen joined him, understanding that some rituals of closure were just as important as the supernatural ones they had performed to break the family's power. As they drove through the transformed landscape toward Willowbrook Cemetery, Chen realized that this case would define the rest of her career. Not because of its supernatural elements, which would probably never be fully accepted by conventional law enforcement, but because of what it had taught her about the importance of truth and the courage required to pursue justice regardless of the obstacles. The cemetery, when they reached it, looked completely different from the night before. The graves were neatly arranged, the headstones were clean and readable, and there was no trace of the supernatural phenomena that had erupted during the ritual. Eleanor Whitmore's grave marker now bore an additional inscription that hadn't been there before, "And those who came after finally at peace." Nearby, a new headstone had appeared overnight, marking a grave that contained nobody but honored a life that had ended 23 years too late. Lily Thorne, 1975-1998. She kept, the truth alive until justice could be served. Marcus knelt beside the markers, finally able to mourn his brother properly after more than 2 decades of uncertainty. Chen stood nearby, understanding that this moment of peace had been purchased with courage, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to the truth. The nightmare that had plagued Millfield for generations was finally over. And in the growing light of dawn, Detective Sarah Chen began planning how to ensure that the story of what had happened here would serve as both a warning and an inspiration for anyone who encountered similar darkness in the future. The truth, no matter how strange or terrible, was always worth fighting for. 6 months after the events at Willowbrook Cemetery, Detective Sarah Chen stood in a federal courthouse in Austin, watching as the last of the conspiracy members was led away in handcuffs. Victoria Whitmore's conviction on 17 counts of murder in the first degree marked the end of the most complex criminal case in Texas history. The trials had taken months to complete, with each family member facing justice for crimes spanning multiple decades. Sheriff Tom Ashford had been sentenced to life without parole for his role in covering up the murders and participating in the rituals. Jim Blackwood received consecutive life sentences for his part in disposing of evidence and preparing victims for the ceremonies, but the legal proceedings were only part of the story that had emerged from that terrible night. Chen walked down the courthouse steps, carrying a thick folder containing the final report that would be archived with the State Attorney General's office, documenting every detail of the conspiracy for future generations. Marcus Caldwell waited. For her at the bottom of the steps, his appearance dramatically changed from the broken man she had first met. The ranch that had been destroyed in the supernatural confrontation had been rebuilt, but this time as a memorial center dedicated to the victims of the family's crimes. The property that had once been a source of supernatural horror had been transformed into a place of healing and remembrance. "How did it feel?" Marcus asked as they walked toward the parking garage. "Watching the last of them get sentenced?" Chen considered the question carefully. "Like justice, but not satisfaction. Nothing can bring back the people they killed, including Danny and Lily. The best we can do is make sure their sacrifices mean something." The media attention surrounding the trials had been intense, with journalists from around the world trying to understand how such an extensive conspiracy had remained hidden for so long. The supernatural elements of the case had been largely kept out of the official record, presented instead as an elaborate psychological manipulation used by the families to control their followers. "Any word from the federal task force?" Marcus asked as they reached Chen's car. Chen nodded, pulling out a letter she had received that morning. "They've identified similar patterns in 3 other states. Families with unexplained influence, missing persons cases that follow the same patterns, financial irregularities that suggest long-term conspiracies. It looks like what happened in Millfield wasn't unique. The revelation that the Blackwood, Ashford and Whitmore families might have been part of a larger network had emerged during the investigation. Financial records showed connections to similar groups in Louisiana, Arkansas and New Mexico, areas where the geological conditions and historical circumstances might have allowed comparable operations to develop. "Are you going to be involved in those investigations?" Marcus asked. Chen smiled, thinking about the assignment she had accepted just that morning. "The Bureau has asked me to head up a new task force specifically focused on these types of cases. Apparently, my experience with unconventional evidence makes me uniquely qualified." As they drove through Austin toward the airport, Chen reflected on how much her life had changed since that night in the cemetery. The case had earned her a promotion and national recognition, but more importantly, it had given her a new understanding of the kinds of evil that could hide behind respectable facades. "I got a letter from Jennifer Phillips yesterday," Marcus said, breaking into her thoughts. "Her documentary about the case is being picked up by a major streaming service. She wants to make sure a portion of the proceeds goes to the victims' families." Jennifer's documentation of the supernatural events had been crucial to the prosecution's case, even though the most extraordinary footage had been classified and sealed by federal authorities. Her public version focused on the human elements of the conspiracy, the family's suffering, the courage of those who fought back, and the importance of never giving up the search for truth. "What about Maria Santos and the others?" Chen asked. "They've all stayed in touch," Marcus replied. "David Chen has been working with geological surveys to identify other areas where similar operations might be possible. Robert Hayes has been helping other families of missing persons navigate the legal system. They've become a kind of support network for people dealing with cases that don't fit normal patterns." As they reached the airport, Chen found herself thinking about the changes that had occurred in Millfield itself. The town had initially struggled with the revelation that its most prominent families had been serial killers, but eventually the community had rallied around the truth rather than trying to cover it up. A new sheriff had been elected, Maria Santos, who had run on a platform of transparency and accountability. The bank and mortuary had been sold to outside interests who had no connection to the conspiracy. The town council had voted to establish a memorial park where the old cemetery had been, honoring all the victims whose names had finally been learned. "Before you leave," Marcus said, reaching into his jacket pocket, "I have something for you." He handed her a small wooden box, hand-carved with symbols that looked familiar. "I made this from wood, taken from the tree that grew over Danny's actual burial site. We found his remains during the excavation of the memorial park. Chen opened the box and found a simple silver locket inside. It was Lily's, Marcus explained. She was wearing it the night she died, and somehow it survived everything that happened. I thought you should have it, since you were the one who helped her complete what she came back to do. Chen fastened the locket around her neck, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with carrying a reminder of Lily's sacrifice. Inside the locket was a small photograph of a young woman who looked exactly as Lily had appeared that first night, but with the carefree expression of someone who had never known the horrors that would define her existence. "There's something else," Marcus said as Chen prepared to board her flight. "The geological survey team found something interesting when they were studying the cave system." He pulled out a manila folder containing photographs and technical reports. "The limestone formations in that area aren't natural. They show evidence of deliberate carving and shaping that goes back at least 1,000 years. Whatever the original inhabitants were doing there, it predates European settlement by centuries." Chen studied the photographs, seeing patterns in the rock formations that suggested a level of sophistication she hadn't expected from pre-Columbian cultures in the region. "Are you saying the gateway itself was ancient?" "I'm saying the families didn't create their power source," Marcus replied. "They found it and perverted it for their own purposes. The original inhabitants were probably guardians, people who understood how to properly manage whatever spiritual forces exist in that place." The implications were staggering. If similar ancient sites existed in other locations, if the pattern Chen was investigating represented a widespread exploitation of pre-existing supernatural infrastructure, then the scope of the problem was far larger than anyone had imagined. "The new task force is going to need this information," Chen said, securing the folder in her briefcase. "If we're going to identify other operations, we need to understand what geological and historical markers to look for." As her flight was called for boarding, Marcus shook her hand with the firm grip of someone who had found peace after decades of uncertainty. "Take care of yourself, detective, and remember what Lily taught us. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones that nobody else will believe need to be fought." Chen boarded the plane thinking about her new assignment and the challenges that lay ahead. The federal task force would be operating with resources and authority that the Millfield investigation had lacked, but they would also be facing adversaries who had learned from the exposure of the Texas conspiracy. During the flight to Washington, she reviewed the case files for the 3 investigations that would be her first priority. Each showed the same patterns that had characterized the Millfield conspiracy: influential families with unexplained wealth, missing persons cases that followed ritualistic patterns, and local law enforcement that seemed remarkably ineffective at solving certain types of crimes. But there were differences as well. The Louisiana operation appeared to be focused on maritime activities, with disappearances occurring near specific bayou locations that had significance in local folklore. The Arkansas group seemed to be connected to mining operations in areas with unusual geological formations. The New Mexico case involved ranching families in regions where Native American sacred sites had been appropriated by European settlers. Chen realized that each location represented a different approach to exploiting the same fundamental phenomenon: places where the barrier between worlds was naturally thin, where spiritual energy could be accessed and manipulated by those who understood the techniques. Her phone rang as the plane reached cruising altitude. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but something about it seemed familiar. Detective Chen. The voice on the other end was young, female, and carried an urgency that reminded her immediately of Lily Thorne. "Yes, who is this? My name is Rebecca Martinez. I'm calling from Roswell, New Mexico. I've been reading about what happened in Millfield, and I think we have the same problem here. People have been disappearing from my reservation for 20 years, always around the new moon. Always from families that have been asking too many questions about the mining operations." Chen felt her pulse quicken. Are you somewhere safe right now? I'm not sure anywhere is safe, Rebecca replied. But I have evidence. Documents that show connections between the mining companies and some very old families. And I think I know where they're taking the people they capture. Stay where you are, Chen instructed, already planning her next move. Don't trust any local authorities until I can get there. And Rebecca, whatever you do, don't investigate this alone. These people are more dangerous than you can imagine. After ending the call, Chen stared out the airplane window at the landscape passing below, thinking about the network of evil that she was now tasked with dismantling. Each location would present its own challenges, its own supernatural complications, and its own courageous individuals willing to risk everything for the truth. But she also thought about the allies she had gained during the Millfield investigation. Marcus, Jennifer, David, Maria, Robert, and others who understood that some battles required unconventional approaches. They would be resources she could call upon as the task force expanded its operations. Most importantly, she carried with her the memory of Lily Thorne's sacrifice and the knowledge that even the most entrenched evil could be defeated by people willing to stand up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. As the plane began its descent into Washington, Chen opened her briefcase and began drafting the preliminary report for her new assignment. The federal task force would need to understand that they weren't just hunting criminals. They were confronting a network of conspiracies that had been operating for generations, protected by supernatural forces that most people would never believe existed. But the events in Millfield had proven that such forces could be overcome, that the truth was stronger than any lie, and that justice was worth fighting for, no matter how impossible the odds might seem. The real work was just beginning, but Chen felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. She had learned from the best teachers possible. A rancher who never gave up searching for his brother, a young woman who waited 23 years for the chance to tell the truth, and a detective who discovered that reality was far stranger and more dangerous than any textbook had ever suggested. The war against the darkness that fed on human suffering was far from over. But for the first time in generations, the forces of light had an advantage. They knew what they were fighting, they understood how to fight it, and they had people willing to pay whatever price was necessary to protect the innocent. As Chen walked through the terminal toward her new assignment, she touched the locket at her throat and whispered a promise that Lily Thorne would never hear but would somehow know was being kept. "We'll finish what you started. All of it." The truth was worth any sacrifice, and justice was worth any risk. And somewhere in the growing darkness of a New Mexico evening, Rebecca Martinez was waiting for help that would finally arrive in time. 3 years had passed since that November night when Marcus Caldwell first found Lily Thorne tied to Eleanor Whitmore's grave. Detective Sarah Chen now stood in the briefing room of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Special Investigations Unit, addressing a room full of agents who specialized in cases that defied conventional explanation. The wall behind her was covered with maps showing 17 different locations across the United States where similar conspiracies had been identified and dismantled. Each pin represented families like the Blackwoods, Ashfords, and Whitmores, multi-generational criminal organizations that had used supernatural manipulation to hide their crimes for decades. "The pattern is consistent across all locations," Chen explained to the assembled agents. "Families arrive in areas with pre-existing spiritual significance, establish themselves as pillars of the community, and then systematically exploit both the supernatural resources and the local population. For their own benefit, Agent Rebecca Martinez sat in the front row, her transformation from frightened witness to federal investigator a testament to the courage that ordinary people could display when confronted with extraordinary evil. The case in New Mexico had been successfully resolved 8 months earlier, with the mining conspiracy exposed and its leaders facing life sentences. What we've learned, Chen continued, is that these operations represent a corruption of ancient protective systems. The original inhabitants of these locations weren't practicing dark magic. They were guardians, people who understood how to maintain the balance between worlds. The revelation had come from archaeological evidence gathered at each site. The European families hadn't created the supernatural gateways they exploited. They had found existing spiritual infrastructure and perverted it for their own purposes, like parasites feeding on a host they didn't understand. The good news, Chen said, advancing to the next slide in her presentation, is that we now have a proven methodology for identifying and dismantling these operations. The Millfield Protocol, as it's come to be known, has been successfully implemented. In every case we've encountered, the protocol combined conventional law enforcement techniques with the spiritual counter-rituals that Danny Caldwell had discovered. Each operation required careful coordination between federal agents, local allies, and individuals who had been personally affected by the conspiracies. The challenge, Agent Martinez added, standing to address the room, is that these families have been in contact with each other for generations. As we expose one operation, the others adapt their methods and strengthen their defenses. Chen nodded, thinking about the intelligence reports that had been flooding in from around the world. Similar patterns had been identified in rural areas of Scotland, remote regions of Australia, and isolated communities in South America. What had started as an investigation into missing persons in a small Texas town had revealed a global network of supernatural exploitation. That's why today's briefing is so important, Chen said. We've received confirmation that the largest and oldest of these operations is located in the mountains of Montana. The families involved have been active since the 1820s, and they've had 200 years to perfect their methods. The Montana operation was different from the others in several crucial ways. Instead of 3 families working together, intelligence suggested a single extended clan that controlled an entire county. Instead of periodic rituals tied to lunar cycles, they appeared to maintain constant spiritual activity, and instead of hiding their influence, they had openly dominated their region for generations. The Ravencroft family, Chen said, displaying photographs of a compound that looked more like a fortress than a ranch. They've controlled Shadowpine County for 8 generations, with family members holding every significant position of authority. Sheriff, mayor, federal judge, state representative, all Ravencrofts or their close allies. Agent Martinez studied the satellite images of the compound. How many people are we talking about? The Texas operation had maybe 60 active participants total. Conservative estimates suggest over 300 family members and associates, Chen replied. And unlike the other operations we've encountered, they don't appear to be hiding their activities from each other. Everyone in Shadowpine County either works for the Ravencrofts or lives in fear of them. The briefing room fell silent as the agents absorbed the magnitude of what they were facing. Previous operations had relied on secrecy and the complicity of a few key officials. The Montana situation represented something closer to an occupied territory than a criminal conspiracy. "What's our timeline?" asked Agent Thompson, a veteran investigator who had worked 3 of the previous cases. Chen pulled up a lunar calendar on the projection screen. Intelligence suggests they're planning something significant for the winter solstice. Communications. Intercepts mention the final opening and 2 centuries of preparation. If we're right about what that means, we can't wait for ideal circumstances. The winter solstice was only 6 weeks away, which meant they had to move quickly to prevent whatever culmination the Ravencroft family had been working toward for 200 years. "We'll need local allies," Agent Martinez observed. "But if the family controls the entire county, who can we trust?" Jen smiled, pulling out a familiar metal box, the same type that had contained Danny Caldwell's evidence. Fortunately, we're not going in blind. Marcus Caldwell has been in contact with someone inside Shadowpine County who's been gathering evidence for years. She opened the box to reveal documents, photographs, and audio recordings that showed the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized Danny's investigation. Dr. Elizabeth Ravencroft, a family member who became a psychiatrist and spent decades documenting the psychological damage caused by their practices. The name caused a stir among the agents. A family member willing to turn against the conspiracy represented the kind of inside information that could make the difference between success and disaster. Dr. Ravencroft has been careful to maintain her cover while gathering evidence, Chen explained. But she's reached out because she believes the winter solstice ritual represents an escalation that could affect areas far beyond Shadowpine County. According to Dr. Ravencroft's intelligence, the Montana operation wasn't just larger than the others. It was intended to serve as a kind of headquarters for coordinating supernatural activities across the entire continent. The winter solstice ritual was designed to permanently expand their sphere of influence, potentially affecting millions of people. We'll have one advantage, Agent Martinez noted. They don't know about the Millfield Protocol. They might be expecting conventional law enforcement tactics, but they won't be prepared for a coordinated spiritual counterattack. Chen gathered the materials back into the metal box, thinking about the allies who had made their previous victories possible. We're putting together a special team for this operation. Marcus Caldwell has volunteered to coordinate the civilian specialists. Jennifer Phillips will document everything for the historical record. Maria Santos will liaise with tribal authorities, who might have knowledge of the original protective systems. The mention of tribal authorities was crucial, unlike the previous operations, which had been conducted on land where the original inhabitants had been completely displaced. The Montana site bordered an active reservation whose elders had maintained oral traditions about the spiritual significance of the region. The Blackfeet Nation has agreed to provide guidance, Chen continued. Their oral histories include specific warnings about the mountain where the Ravencroft compound is located. They've been waiting 200 years for someone to listen to those warnings. As the briefing concluded, Chen found herself thinking about Lily Thorne and the sacrifice that had made all of their subsequent victories possible. The young woman who had waited 23 years for justice had sparked a movement that was now capable of challenging centuries of supernatural oppression. Agent Martinez approached her as the other agents filed out of the briefing room. "Do you think we can actually do this? Take on an operation that's been building power for 200 years? Chen touched the locket at her throat, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with carrying Lily's memory. "I think we have to try. Every person they've killed, every family they've destroyed, every community they've terrorized, they all deserve justice." Outside the FBI building, the late autumn sun was setting over Washington, D.C., casting long shadows that reminded Chen of that first night in Willowbrook Cemetery. But this time, she wasn't facing the unknown alone. She had experienced allies, proven methods, and the knowledge that even the most entrenched evil could be overcome by people willing to stand up for the truth. The final battle was approaching, and for the first time in 2 centuries, the forces of light had a real chance of victory. The network of supernatural conspiracies that had fed on human suffering for generations was about to discover that their time of impunity was finally coming to an end. In 6 weeks, under the cold light of the winter solstice moon, the truth would once again prove stronger than the darkness. And somewhere in the realm beyond death, the spirits of Danny Caldwell, Lily Thorne, and countless other victims would finally see the justice they had died trying to achieve. The war against the shadows was entering its final phase, and Detective Sarah Chen was ready to finish what a young rancher's brother had started so many years ago in a small Texas town where the dead had learned to speak for themselves. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.